Your dry rub is not just seasoning. Every single ingredient in that blend is running a chemical reaction on the surface of your meat, and most people have no idea any of it is happening. Salt is essentially brining your meat from the outside in. Sugar is priming the surface for caramelization, and certain spices are bonding with proteins to build entirely new flavor compounds that don't exist anywhere in the jar. Once you understand what's actually going on, you'll never build a rub the same way again. Today, we're going deep into the science of the perfect dry rub, what each component does at a molecular level, how to layer those effects for maximum flavor impact, and the exact ratio framework that professional chefs use to build rubs that taste like they took years to develop. We've got a pro-level recipe at the end that you'll want to write down, so stick with me. Let's start with salt, because salt is doing the heaviest lifting of anything in your rub, and most people treat it like an afterthought. When you apply salt to a raw piece of meat, osmosis kicks in almost immediately. The salt draws surface moisture out of the meat, creating a thin brine on the exterior. That brine then gets pulled back inside the muscle fibers, carrying dissolved salt with it. This is essentially a rapid dry brine, and it transforms the internal texture of the meat before it ever touches heat. The muscle proteins denature slightly, which means they hold on to moisture better during cooking. The result is a piece of meat that stays juicier, seasons more deeply, and has noticeably more flavor all the way through, not just on the outside. Here's where timing matters more than most people realize. If you apply your rub and cook immediately, within about 15 minutes, you'll get decent surface flavor. But if you let that salt work for 45 minutes to an hour, or ideally overnight in the fridge, the brine cycle completes fully. You get penetration. That's the difference between a good steak and a great one, and it costs you nothing but patience. Now sugar, and here's where things get genuinely interesting, and where I want you to hold a question in the back of your mind. Why do some rubs burn at high heat, while others form a perfect mahogany crust? We'll come back to that in a moment, because the answer is more nuanced than you'd expect. Sugar's primary job in a rub is caramelization, and more specifically, the Maillard reaction. The Maillard reaction is the browning process that creates hundreds of complex flavor compounds when proteins and sugars are exposed to heat, typically above 140 degrees Celsius or about 280 Fahrenheit. Its lice-seared meat tastes infinitely better than boiled meat. It's the crust on a brisket, the bark on a rack of ribs, that deep roasted complexity you can't get any other way. But here's the catch. Different sugars hit their burn point at different temperatures.
White granulated sugar burns at around 160 degrees Celsius, which is fine for a long, low and slow smoke. But if you're searing over high direct heat, it scorches before it caramelizes, and you get bitterness instead of sweetness. Brown sugar has more moisture and molasses content, which gives it a slightly lower burn point, but also a deeper, more complex flavor profile. Turbinado sugar, raw cane sugar, has larger crystals that dissolve more slowly and hold up better over high heat. And then there's honey powder or coconut sugar, both of which have unique flavor notes that regular sugar simply can't replicate. So the answer to that open question, why do some rubs burn while others don't, comes down to which sugar you're using and how you're cooking. For a high-heat sear on a ribeye, turbinado or coconut sugar. For a 12-hour pork shoulder smoke, brown sugar all day long. Now here's the part that most rub guides completely skip over, and it's the part that separates fine dining from backyard cooking. Certain spices don't just add flavor, they chemically react with the proteins and fats in meat to create entirely new aromatic compounds that don't exist in the spice itself. Take smoked paprika. When it hits the surface of a fatty cut and gets exposed to heat, the carotenoid pigments in the paprika, the same compounds that give it that deep red color, interact with the Maillard reaction byproducts to generate new volatiles. You get a roasted, almost sweet smokiness that's distinct from the paprika alone. Black pepper contains piperine, which is a bioavailability enhancer. It literally helps your body absorb the flavor compounds from other spices more effectively, which is why pepper and pretty much every other spice taste better together. Cumin contains aldehydes that under heat react with meat proteins to create a deeply savory, almost nutty character. And dried chili, whether ancho, guajillo, or chipotle, contains capsaicin compounds that don't just add heat, they stimulate the same nerve receptors as heat itself, which means the meat actually tastes hotter as it cooks.
This is why a well-built rub tastes alive in a way that sprinkling seasoning at the table never does. The heat is doing chemistry for you. So how do you actually build one? Here's the framework that pro chefs use. Think of it as a ratio, not a fixed recipe. 40% salt, that's the foundation. 20% sugar, that's your Maillard driver. 20% base spice, something warm and earthy like smoked paprika, cumin, or ancho chili powder. 10% aromatics, garlic powder, onion powder, dried herbs. And 10% accent, black pepper, cayenne, mustard powder, or something more adventurous like ground espresso or dried citrus zest. Here's the actual recipe I want you to try. 2 tablespoons of kosher salt, 1 tablespoon of brown sugar, 1 tablespoon of smoked paprika, half a tablespoon of garlic powder, half a tablespoon of onion powder.
1 teaspoon of coarsely cracked black pepper, half a teaspoon of ground cumin, 1/4 teaspoon of cayenne. If you're using this on a fatty, well-marbled cut, like a pork shoulder or short rib, add half a teaspoon of ground coffee. The bitterness cuts through the fat beautifully and gives the bark an almost chocolatey depth that you won't believe until you try it. Coat your meat generously. Don't pat it on, press it in. You want that salt making contact. Let it sit uncovered in the fridge for at least 4 hours. Overnight is better. When it comes out, you'll see the surface is slightly tacky and damp. That's the brine cycle doing exactly what it's supposed to do. That surface is going to accept smoke, accept heat, and build a crust that is genuinely something else. Pitmaster's tip time. The single biggest mistake people make with dry rubs is applying them wet. If you're rubbing oil on the meat first to help the spices stick, you are creating a barrier that slows down the salt's ability to penetrate the muscle. Instead, apply your rub to completely dry, paper towel padded meat, no oil. The moisture already present in the meat surface is enough to make the rub adhere, and the salt will work without interference. If you want oil, brush a very light coat on after the rub has had at least 30 minutes to start its work. One more thing, and this is the point that tends to genuinely change how people season meat. The size of your salt crystals matters enormously. Kosher salt has larger, irregular flakes that distribute evenly and dissolve at the right rate during the dry brining process. Fine table salt is about twice as salty by volume, so if a recipe calls for kosher and you use table salt, you'll oversalt without realizing it. Sea salt flakes are beautiful but expensive for rubs where the crystal structure gets dissolved anyway. Keep kosher salt as your default dry rub base, and you'll always be calibrated correctly. Next time you build a rub, you're not just mixing spices, you're engineering a series of chemical reactions that begin the moment the salt hits the surface and don't finish until the meat comes off the heat. Salt draws and brines, sugar caramelizes and drives the Maillard reaction. Spices transform under heat into compounds that don't exist anywhere in the jar. That's not flavoring, that's cooking at a molecular level. And once you start thinking about it this way, your food changes. What's your go-to rub ingredient, the one thing you'd never leave out? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely read every single one. If you're not subscribed yet, hit that button. Next time we're tackling the art of the reverse sear on a tomahawk steak and you do not want to miss it.